I'm honestly tired of her opinion. It doesn't matter what she thinks anyway. I wish she would just stay out of it.
I'm sorry, but she is a burden to this family. We can't keep her here.
What do you want me to say?
The night my son called me a burden was the same night I paid his rent. He didn't know I was standing in the hallway outside his kitchen when I heard my daughter-in-law laugh and say, "Your mother is becoming a walking burden." What hurt even more was hearing my son agree. I stood there frozen, holding a casserole dish I had spent 3 hours making for a family dinner they barely acknowledged. Neither of them knew a secret I had protected for years. Without me, they wouldn't even be living in that house. And 2 weeks later, I made a decision that changed every one of our lives. I stopped paying their rent. If you've ever felt unappreciated by the people you love most, I'd love to hear your story. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to your heart. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd truly love to read your messages. My name is Lois Johnston, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved your family enough, they would eventually love you back the same way. At 67 years old, I still wanted to believe that. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. I live in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, in the same house my husband Robert and I bought nearly 40 years ago. It's nothing fancy. A white 2-story home with blue shutters, a wraparound porch, and a backyard where Robert planted maple trees when our children were young. Every corner of that house carries memories. The pencil marks on the laundry room wall where we measured Ethan and Rachel's height every birthday. The dining room table where we celebrated graduations, anniversaries, and countless Thanksgiving dinners. The front porch swing where Robert and I spent summer evenings talking about our dreams for retirement. Back then, our future seemed simple. Grow old together, watch our grandchildren grow, enjoy the life we spent decades building. But life rarely follows the plans we make. 7 years ago, Robert died unexpectedly from a heart attack. One day he was laughing while grilling hamburgers in the backyard. The next morning he was gone. I still remember standing in the hospital hallway feeling like someone had reached inside my chest and torn away half of my heart. For months after his funeral, I barely functioned. I would wake up expecting to hear his footsteps downstairs. I would reach across the bed at night only to find cold sheets. The silence became unbearable. During that period, my children seemed concerned. Ethan called frequently. Rachel visited every weekend. They told me they worried about me living alone. At the time, I felt grateful. I thought tragedy had brought us closer together. Looking back now, I realize that was only the beginning of a very different relationship. As the years passed, the calls became less frequent. The visits became shorter. Then gradually, I became the one doing all the work to keep the family connected. I called first. I planned holiday dinners. I organized birthdays. I remembered anniversaries. I checked on everyone. If I didn't reach out, weeks sometimes passed without hearing from either of my children. At first, I made excuses for them. They were busy. Life was stressful. They had responsibilities. That's what mothers do. We protect our children even when they're hurting us. Ethan was 43 and lived about 30 minutes away with his wife Melissa and their daughter Sophie. Rachel was 40 years old and lived across town in a condominium she constantly complained about. Both of them always seemed to have problems. Financial problems, work problems, relationship problems. Problems that somehow always landed on my doorstep. The first time Ethan asked for money was about 5 years after Robert died. He called late one evening. I could hear panic in his voice. "Mom," he said, "I hate asking this, but we're in trouble." My heart immediately dropped. What happened? He explained that business at the company where he worked had slowed down. Hours were being cut. Bills were piling up. He was worried about providing for his family, especially Sophie. I remember sitting at my kitchen table listening to him. Every instinct I had as a mother screamed at me to help. So I did. I sent money, not because he demanded it, not because I felt obligated, because I loved him. Months later, Rachel needed help. A credit card balance. Then a car repair. Then a medical expense that insurance didn't fully cover. Again, I helped. At first the amounts were small. A few $100s here. A few hundred there. Nothing that seriously affected my savings. Robert had been responsible with money. Before he died, he made sure I would be comfortable. Not wealthy, not rich. Just secure. Enough to live without fear. Enough to enjoy retirement. Enough to sleep peacefully at night. Or at least, that was the plan. The strange thing was that neither Ethan nor Rachel ever seemed embarrassed about accepting help. They always thanked me. But the gratitude never lasted long. Within weeks, another request would appear. Another emergency. Another crisis. Another reason they couldn't manage without assistance. Over time, I noticed something else. The more I gave, the less appreciation I received. The help became expected, normal, automatic, like turning on a faucet. One Christmas, I spent nearly $2,000 buying gifts for everyone. I carefully selected things I knew they wanted. For Sophie, a laptop she needed for school. For Rachel, a designer handbag she'd been admiring. For Ethan, a new television. I remember feeling excited watching them open everything. I thought seeing them happy would make me happy too. Instead, something strange happened. After the gifts were opened, everyone immediately started talking about themselves. Nobody asked what I had received. Nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody even noticed that I hadn't opened a single present. I drove home that night feeling emptier than when I arrived. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Families aren't perfect. People get distracted. People forget. That was what I kept telling myself. Then there was Melissa. My daughter-in-law and I were never particularly close. We were polite, friendly on the surface. But there was always a distance between us, an invisible wall. Whenever I offered advice, she looked irritated. Whenever I shared a story, she seemed bored. Whenever I visited, I often felt like an unwelcome guest. I tried not to take it personally. Maybe our personalities simply didn't match. Maybe I was imagining things. Yet every time I left their house, I carried home the same uncomfortable feeling, like I was tolerated rather than loved, like my presence was an obligation. Not a joy. The only person who still occasionally made me feel wanted was Sophie. When she was younger, she adored visiting Grandma's house. We baked cookies, worked in the garden, watched old movies together. But as she grew older, Even that began to change. Teenagers naturally become closer to their parents than grandparents. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was harder to admit. The entire family was slowly drifting away from me. And I kept trying harder to pull them back. I invited everyone for Sunday dinners. Sometimes they canceled at the last minute. I offered help whenever they needed it. They rarely refused. I bought birthday presents, sent holiday cards, remembered every important date. Yet somehow I felt increasingly invisible. What I didn't realize then was that my loneliness had made me vulnerable. I was so afraid of losing my family that I had started confusing love with sacrifice. I thought the more I gave, the more they would value me. The more I helped, the closer we would become. I couldn't have been more wrong, because while I was busy trying to hold the family together, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. Something I hadn't fully acknowledged. Something that would eventually force me to confront a painful truth. My children weren't just accepting my help anymore. They were beginning to depend on it. And in one case, a far more than anyone realized, including the rest of the family, especially Melissa, because there was one secret I had been carrying for years, a secret that, if revealed, would completely change the way everyone saw Ethan and the way they saw me. At the time, I still believed I was protecting my son. I had no idea that secret would one day destroy everything. The secret started with a phone call on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I remember the day clearly because it was only 3 months before Sophie's 14th birthday. I was folding laundry when Ethan called. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He sounded defeated, not stressed, not worried, defeated. "Mom," he said quietly, "can you come over? I need to talk to you." An hour later, I was sitting at his kitchen table while he stared at a cup of coffee that had gone cold. His shoulders were slumped. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. For the first time since Robert died, I saw genuine fear in my son's face. "They let me go." The words came out barely above a whisper. My heart sank. What happened? The company downsized. He rubbed his forehead. "I've been looking for work for 2 months. 2 months. I couldn't believe he had carried that burden alone for so long. What about unemployment?" "It helps, but it's not enough." His eyes finally met mine. "We're behind on everything." I looked around the house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was comfortable. 3 bedrooms, a good neighborhood, excellent schools for Sophie. The kind of place a family could build a life. Then Ethan said the words that changed everything. "We might lose the house." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I knew what losing that house would mean. Moving, changing schools, starting over. More stress, more instability. Most of all, I imagined Sophie caught in the middle of it all. I couldn't bear the thought. "What do you need?" I finally asked. The relief on Ethan's face appeared instantly. He explained that they were already 2 months behind on rent. The landlord had started sending notices. If they missed another payment, eviction proceedings could begin. Without hesitation, I offered to help. At the time, I believed it would be temporary. A few months, maybe 6. Just enough time for Ethan to find another job. I never imagined that conversation would define the next several years of my life. The first payment was difficult. Not financially, emotionally. I worried Robert would disapprove. He had always believed adults needed to stand on their own feet. Yet he also loved our children fiercely. In the end, I convinced myself I was helping Sophie more than anyone else. That made the decision easier. The months passed. Ethan found another job. Then another problem appeared. The new position paid less. Then Melissa had unexpected medical expenses. Then their car needed repairs. Then inflation increased everything. There was always something. Always another emergency. Always another reason they couldn't quite get ahead. Each time I thought about stopping the assistance, Ethan would call. Sometimes he sounded embarrassed, sometimes desperate, sometimes exhausted, and every single time I said yes, because that's what mothers do. Or at least that's what I believed. Meanwhile, life inside the family slowly changed. The more I helped, the less respect I seemed to receive. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. At family dinners, Ethan often interrupted me before I finished speaking. Rachel rolled her eyes whenever I shared advice. Melissa rarely hid her impatience anymore. One Thanksgiving, I spent 2 days preparing food: turkey, stuffing, sweet potato casserole, homemade pies. I arrived early to help. By the end of the evening, nobody had thanked me. They were too busy arguing about politics and scrolling through their phones. Driving home afterward, I cried the entire way. Not because of the work, because I felt invisible. Yet somehow I still kept showing up. The following year became even harder. Rachel started depending on me more frequently as well. A car payment, a credit card balance, unexpected bills. Unlike Ethan, she never seemed ashamed when asking. She simply assumed I would help. "You're in a better position than I am, Mom." That became her favorite phrase. I hated hearing it, not because it was completely false, but because it ignored everything Robert and I sacrificed to build that security. We worked overtime, skipped vacations, drove old cars, saved every dollar we could. Nothing had been handed to us. Yet somehow my children spoke about my financial stability as though it appeared by magic. As though it existed solely to solve their problems. The hardest part wasn't the money. It was the way they treated me afterward. They never acted grateful, only relieved. As if my help was expected. As if it belonged to them. One Saturday afternoon, I arrived at Ethan's house to babysit Sophie while Ethan and Melissa attended a wedding. I wasn't feeling particularly well that day. My arthritis had been bothering me. Still, I didn't want to disappoint them. When I arrived, Melissa handed me a list. Lunch instructions, homework instructions, cleaning instructions. Cleaning instructions. I stared at that part. "Cleaning?" I asked. Melissa smiled. "We've both been really busy." Before I could respond, she was already walking toward the door. "We appreciate it." Then she left. I spent the next 6 hours watching Sophie, washing dishes, folding laundry, and cleaning their kitchen. Not once did anyone ask whether I needed help. Not once did anyone consider that I was 67 years old. I felt less like a grandmother and more like unpaid staff. That evening, Ethan thanked me with a quick hug, then immediately asked if I could help cover Sophie's summer camp tuition. I wish I could say I refused. I didn't. I wrote the check. Every time I gave in, I told myself it would be the last time. Every time I was wrong. Then there was Sophie, my sweet granddaughter, the one person I thought still saw me. For years we had been close, but even that relationship began changing. At first, It was small things. She stopped calling, stopped asking to visit, stopped sitting beside me at family gatherings. Teenagers grow up. I understood that. But sometimes I noticed something deeper. She occasionally laughed when others made jokes at my expense. Not cruelly, not maliciously, just enough to fit in, just enough to avoid standing apart from her parents. Each time it happened, it felt like another tiny crack in my heart. One Sunday dinner stands out more than any other. Rachel was complaining about money again. Melissa was complaining about work. Ethan was complaining about the economy. The entire evening became a competition over who had the hardest life. At one point, I casually mentioned that my water heater had broken. The repair would cost nearly $3,000. The room fell silent. Not because anyone felt sorry for me. Because they were calculating whether that expense would affect their future requests. I could see it in their faces. Then Rachel laughed. "Well, at least you can afford it." Everyone chuckled. Even Ethan. I forced a smile. But something inside me shifted. For the first time, I realized they no longer saw me as a person. They saw me as a resource, a safety net, an emergency fund, a solution, not a mother, not a grandmother, not Lois. And still, despite all the warning signs, I continued protecting Ethan's biggest secret. Nobody knew that the rent payments were coming from me. Not Melissa, not Rachel, not Sophie. Nobody. The arrangement remained hidden because Ethan begged me to keep it private. He said he was embarrassed. He said he didn't want his wife to worry. He promised it was temporary. I believed him. What I didn't know was that the secret had already started changing him. Every lie requires another lie. Every dependency grows stronger over time. And soon, that secret would become impossible to hide. Because the next family gathering would expose something far more painful than financial dependence. It would reveal exactly how little my sacrifices meant to the people I loved most. The secret became a routine long before I realized how dangerous that was. At first, helping Ethan with rent felt like a temporary solution, a bridge between hardship and stability. A mother helping her son through a difficult season. But seasons are supposed to end. This one didn't. 3 years after that rainy afternoon when Ethan first told me he was behind on rent, I was still making monthly payments. Not every month at first, then every other month, then almost every month. Eventually, the arrangement became so normal that Ethan stopped sounding embarrassed when he called. That should have been my first warning. Instead, I kept telling myself I was protecting my family. One afternoon, I sat across from Ethan at a small diner near his neighborhood. He looked healthier than he had when he lost his job. He had steady employment again. His clothes were nicer. His car was newer. Yet somehow the financial emergencies never disappeared. "I just need a little help this month," he said. I stared at him. "Ethan, you've been saying that for years." His face tightened. For a moment, I thought he might finally tell me the truth. Instead, he sighed dramatically. "You know how expensive everything is." I did know. Everyone was struggling with rising costs. But something felt different. Something wasn't adding up. I watched him pull out a brand new phone from his pocket. The latest model. Far more expensive than the one I carried. The contradiction bothered me. But I pushed the thought away. I didn't want to become suspicious of my own son. That evening, after returning home, I sat in Robert's old recliner. It was still my favorite place in the house. The leather had worn smooth from years of use. Sometimes I could almost imagine Robert sitting there beside me. I often found myself talking to him when nobody else was around. That night was one of those times. "I don't know if I'm helping anymore," I whispered. The empty room offered no answer, but for the first time, doubt had entered my heart. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller introduced himself as Mr. Thompson, the landlord. At first, I panicked. Had something happened? Was Ethan being evicted? Instead, Mr. Thompson simply needed paperwork renewed, because technically, I wasn't just paying rent. I was also the guarantor on the lease. That fact shocked most people when they eventually learned it. Years earlier, after Ethan lost his job, the landlord had required additional security before renewing the lease. Ethan's income wasn't enough. His credit had suffered. Without another guarantor, they would have lost the house. I stepped in immediately. I signed the paperwork. I guaranteed the lease. I promised to cover any missed payments. At the time, I viewed it as an act of love. Now I wasn't so sure. While reviewing the documents with Mr. Thompson, I noticed something interesting. The lease had been renewed twice. Each time, Ethan had assured the landlord that his financial situation was improving. Each time, nothing actually changed. That realization sat heavily on my shoulders. Later that week, I invited Rachel to lunch. Part of me wanted reassurance. I wanted someone to tell me I was imagining things. Instead, the conversation made me even more uneasy. Rachel spent nearly the entire meal complaining. Her job, her apartment, her bills, her ex-husband, her friends. Everything in her life seemed to be someone else's fault. When the check arrived, she glanced at it and pushed it toward me without even asking, as though paying was automatic, as though it wasn't even a question. I quietly covered the bill. She never noticed. Driving home afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about the pattern. Neither of my children saw my help as a gift anymore. They saw it as a permanent feature of their lives, like electricity, like running water. Something that simply existed, something that would always be there. The realization hurt more than I expected. Still, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. It started with Melissa. For years, I had assumed she knew about the rent assistance. Why wouldn't she? She was Ethan's wife. Surely they discussed major financial matters. One Saturday morning, I arrived at Sophie's soccer tournament. Melissa and I ended up sitting together in the bleachers. The game hadn't started yet. We made small talk, weather, traffic, school. Then she casually mentioned wanting to remodel their kitchen. I nearly choked on my coffee. A remodel. She smiled. Nothing huge. Maybe $20,000. $20,000. My stomach tightened. How could they be discussing expensive renovations while I was paying their rent before I could stop myself? I asked. Can you really afford that? Melissa laughed. Of course. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Ethan's always been good at figuring things out. I stared at her. She genuinely believed her husband was financially stable. She had absolutely no idea. Not about the missed rent. Not about the guarantees. Not about the thousands of dollars I had quietly provided over the years. Nothing. In that moment, I realized the secret had grown far beyond what I originally intended. I wasn't simply helping my son. I was helping him maintain a lie so large that even his wife couldn't see it. The game started. Parents cheered. Children ran across the field. But I barely noticed. My thoughts were elsewhere. What else was Ethan hiding? How long had he been misleading Melissa? And perhaps most importantly, why that question haunted me for weeks. Then came another incident. One that I should have paid more attention to. Sophie needed money for a school trip. Ethan called asking if I could contribute. Again, I agreed. Of course I did. But later that evening, I saw photos on social media. Ethan and Melissa were out celebrating at an expensive steakhouse. The bill for that dinner alone could have covered half of Sophie's trip. I stared at the photos for a long time. The smiling faces, the cocktails, the luxury meals, the carefree expressions. Meanwhile, I was the one paying for school activities. Something inside me began to harden. Not into anger, not yet, into awareness. For years, I had viewed myself as the solution, the helper, the rescuer. Now I started wondering if I had become part of the problem. Every dollar I provided allowed difficult conversations to be avoided. Every rescue postponed accountability. Every sacrifice made it easier for Ethan to continue living a life he couldn't actually afford. And still, despite everything, I wasn't ready to stop. Not because Ethan deserved it. Because I love Sophie. I love my grandchildren. I love my family, even when they didn't seem to love me the same way. Then one evening, Mr. Thompson called again. His voice carried a tone I hadn't heard before. Concern. Mrs. Johnston, he said carefully. I thought you should know something. My grip tightened on the phone. What is it? There was a pause. Then he spoke. And the information he shared would become the first crack in the foundation of everything I believed about my son. A crack that would eventually bring the entire secret crashing down. Mrs. Johnston, I hope you don't mind me saying this. Mr. Thompson sounded hesitant on the phone. What is it? I asked. There was a brief pause. Then he cleared his throat. I've noticed your son has been talking about buying a house. I frowned. A house. Yes. I sat upright in my chair. Buying a house made no sense. Not when I was still helping pay rent. Not when Ethan constantly described his finances as a disaster. Not when every month seemed to bring another emergency. Mr. Thompson continued carefully. He asked me whether I would provide a rental history letter to help support a future mortgage application. The room suddenly felt colder. I thanked him for the information and ended the call. For several minutes, I sat staring at the wall. A mortgage. A house. Either Ethan had somehow become financially stable overnight, or he wasn't telling me the truth. Neither possibility felt good. That conversation lingered in my mind for weeks. Still, I avoided confronting him. Part of me feared what I might discover. Part of me still wanted to believe the best about my son. Then my birthday arrived, and everything changed. My 67th birthday fell on a Saturday. Normally, I didn't make a big deal out of birthdays anymore. At my age, they felt less exciting than they once had. Still, family traditions mattered to me. For decades, we had celebrated together. Even after Robert passed away, especially after Robert passed away, those gatherings helped me feel connected, needed, remembered. 3 days before my birthday, Ethan called. Mom, we're doing dinner at our place. My heart lifted. Really? Of course. It's your birthday. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely happy. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe the family still cared more than I realized. I spent Friday afternoon baking desserts. 1 chocolate pie, 1 apple pie, Sophie's favorite cookies. I even bought a new blouse for the occasion. Nothing expensive, just something nice. Something that made me feel presentable. Saturday evening arrived. I drove to Ethan's house carrying the desserts. The moment I walked inside, something felt off. Nobody greeted me. Melissa was scrolling through her phone. Rachel sat on the couch watching television. Ethan was in the backyard grilling. No decorations. No birthday banner. No flowers. No wrapped gifts. Nothing. I immediately told myself not to be sensitive. Maybe they had planned a surprise. Maybe they were waiting until dinner. I placed the desserts in the kitchen. Then Melissa looked up. "Oh, good." "Good?" I asked. "You brought dessert." I smiled awkwardly. "Of course." A few minutes later, she added another request. "Can you help finish dinner?" I stared at her. Finish dinner. The potatoes still need to be peeled. I looked around. Everyone else remained seated. Nobody offered assistance. Apparently, the birthday guest was also the kitchen staff. Again, I swallowed my disappointment. Again, I told myself not to overreact. For the next hour, I cooked, peeled potatoes, prepared vegetables, set the table, served food. Exactly as I had done countless times before. Eventually, everyone sat down to eat. The conversation revolved around Ethan's work, Rachel's problems, Sophie's college plans. Nobody mentioned my birthday. Not once. Halfway through dinner, Sophie looked up from her phone. "What are we having cake for?" The question stunned me. She had forgotten, too. Ethan laughed. "It's Grandma's birthday." "Oh." She returned to her phone. That single word hurt more than I expected. Not because Sophie was intentionally cruel, because it showed how little importance I held in the family anymore. After dinner, everyone immediately disappeared. Rachel took a phone call. Melissa went upstairs. Ethan started watching sports. I found myself cleaning the kitchen alone on my birthday, washing dishes, scrubbing pans, loading the dishwasher. The same tasks I would have completed on any ordinary day. At one point, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired, older than 67. For the first time, I wondered whether Robert would even recognize the woman I had become. A woman constantly sacrificing herself for people who barely noticed. Around 9 o'clock, I decided it was time to leave. I went searching for my purse. That's when everything happened. I walked down the hallway toward the guest room where I had left it. As I approached the kitchen entrance, I heard voices. Melissa's voice, Rachel's voice, then Ethan's. They were standing in the kitchen I had just cleaned. Something about their tone made me stop. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my name, and I froze. "Honestly," Melissa said, "I don't know how much longer we can keep doing this." Rachel laughed. "Doing what?" "Babysitting Lois's feelings all the time." The words hit me like a slap. I remained perfectly still. My heart began pounding. Rachel chuckled. "She's lonely. She's exhausting," Melissa replied. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The sentence that still echoes in my memory. "She's basically a walking burden." Silence filled the hallway. My chest tightened. I waited, desperately, praying someone would defend me, especially Ethan. Surely Ethan would say something. Surely my own son wouldn't allow that kind of insult. Several seconds passed. Then Ethan sighed. Not angry, not offended, just tired. You know how Mom is. That was it. That was all he said. No defense, no correction, no disagreement, just acceptance. Agreement disguised as exhaustion. My vision blurred. For years I had tolerated disrespect, ignored warning signs, made excuses. But hearing my son validate those words shattered something inside me. The woman paying his rent, the woman protecting his secrets, the woman funding his lifestyle. A burden. I wanted to walk into the kitchen. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood silently in the hallway while they continued talking, and what I heard next hurt even more. Rachel laughed. If we're being honest, she probably needs to move into some kind of senior community eventually. Melissa immediately agreed. That would solve a lot of problems. My stomach dropped. A lot of problems. Was that how they saw me? Not as family, not as a mother, not as a grandmother. A problem, an obstacle, something that needed to be managed. Something inconvenient. Tears filled my eyes. I quietly retrieved my purse and slipped out through the front door without saying goodbye. Nobody noticed. Nobody came after me. Nobody called. The entire drive home, I replayed the conversation again and again. A burden, a problem, an inconvenience. The words followed me into the darkness. When I finally arrived home, I sat alone in Robert's recliner. The house felt unusually silent. For hours, I stared at the family photos on the wall. Birthdays, vacations, Christmas mornings. Decades of memories. I kept asking myself the same question. How had we ended up here? How had I become the burden? And then another question surfaced. One I could no longer ignore. If they truly believed I was such a burden, why was I still carrying theirs for the first time in years? I seriously considered stopping the money, stopping the rescue missions, stopping the endless sacrifices. But I still didn't know the full truth. I still didn't know what Ethan and Rachel had been discussing before I walked away. And what they planned for me was far worse than simply calling me a burden. Much worse. I barely slept after my birthday. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Melissa's voice. She's basically a walking burden. Then Ethan's response. You know how Mom is. The words replayed endlessly, like a song I couldn't turn off. For days afterward, I avoided calling anyone. That alone was unusual. Normally, I was the one reaching out, the one checking in, the one making sure everyone stayed connected. This time, I stayed silent. And something interesting happened. Nobody noticed. Not Ethan, not Rachel, not Melissa, not even Sophie. 4 days passed, then 5, then 6. No phone calls, no texts, no concern, nothing. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. If I disappeared for a week, my family barely noticed. Meanwhile, I spent those days thinking about every sacrifice I'd made over the years. The money, the time, the emotional energy, the constant rescuing. For the first time, I stopped asking whether they appreciated me. Instead, I asked a different question. What exactly had my sacrifices accomplished? The answer wasn't pleasant. They hadn't created gratitude. They'd created dependence. The following Friday, Ethan called. Not to ask how I was doing, not to apologize, and not to mention my birthday, to ask for a favor. Of course. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful, as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't allowed his wife to call me a burden, as though my birthday had been perfectly normal. "Hi, Ethan. I've got a question." I nearly laughed. Naturally, he did. "What is it?" "We need someone to watch the kids next Saturday. Not, how are you? Not, did you enjoy your birthday? Not, I've been thinking about you." Straight to the request. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. "I'm not sure." A long silence followed. Ethan seemed genuinely surprised. "You aren't sure?" "That's right." Another pause. Then he cleared his throat. "Well, Melissa and I already made plans." For years, that sentence would have worked on me. I would have rearranged everything, canceled appointments, ignored my own needs. This time I didn't. "I'm sorry." His voice hardened slightly. "Okay," then he hung up. No goodbye, no concern, no conversation. Just disappointment that his free babysitter wasn't available. That night, I sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed orange behind Robert's maple trees. I found myself talking to him again. "I think I failed." The words surprised even me, because deep down, I believed them. Maybe I had failed as a mother. Maybe I'd given too much. Maybe I'd protected my children from consequences for so long that they never learned responsibility. The next week brought another family gathering. A barbecue at Ethan's house. Part of me wanted to stay home, but another part needed answers. I needed to know whether what I overheard on my birthday had been a terrible misunderstanding, or the truth. When I arrived, everyone seemed perfectly normal. Too normal. Rachel hugged me. Melissa smiled. Ethan asked how I was doing. The performance almost fooled me. Almost. Then I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Not as a mother desperate to believe the best. As an observer. And what I noticed disturbed me. Every conversation eventually drifted toward money. Rachel complained about rising costs. Melissa talked about needing more space. Ethan discussed housing prices. It felt less like family conversation and more like a business meeting. Then Rachel said something strange. "We really need to start thinking long-term." Melissa nodded. "Exactly." I watched them exchange a look that suggested an ongoing conversation, something already discussed. My stomach tightened. Long-term. About what? Several minutes later, I found out, or at least part of it. The adults had gathered around the patio table while the children were inside. I had stepped away to grab a drink. As I approached the kitchen door, I heard my name again. Instinctively, I stopped. Not because I wanted to spy, because experience had taught me that people often revealed their true thoughts when they believed you weren't listening. Rachel spoke first. "We can't keep ignoring the situation." Melissa agreed. "Eventually, something has to happen." Then Ethan said something that made my blood run cold. "She's getting older." Silence followed. Rachel sighed. "I know." Melissa lowered her voice. "Have either of you looked at assisted living facilities?" My hand tightened around the glass I was holding. For a moment, I wondered whether I had misheard. Assisted living. They were discussing assisted living. For me. Without me. before anyone had even spoken to me, before anyone had asked what I wanted. My heart pounded. Then Ethan continued. It might actually be better. Better. Better for whom? Certainly not for me. I lived independently. I drove, cooked, maintained my home, managed my finances, volunteered, socialized. There was absolutely no reason for assisted living, except convenience. Convenience for them. Then the conversation became even worse. Rachel said something I'll never forget. That house is too much for one person anyway. My breath caught. The house. Robert's house. Our house. The home we'd spent 40 years building. The home filled with memories. The home where my children grew up. They weren't talking about my well-being. They were talking about my property. I suddenly understood, and once I understood, everything else started falling into place. The strange conversations, the sudden interest in my future, the discussions about long-term planning. None of it was really about me. It was about what I owned. Then Melissa asked the question that confirmed every fear. What would happen with the house if she moved? Rachel answered first. We could sell it. Sell it. Just like that. As though the house were a spare piece of furniture. Not a lifetime of memories. Not the last place where I still felt connected to Robert. Sell it. My eyes filled with tears, but I stayed hidden, because I needed to hear the rest. Then Ethan spoke again. The equity alone would solve a lot of problems. The words hit harder than anything else. A lot of problems. Suddenly everything became clear. The rent, the financial struggles, the constant requests. My house represented money. Money they had already mentally spent. Money they believed would eventually become theirs. The discussion continued. They talked about timing, options, possibilities. Not once did anyone mention my feelings. Not once did anyone ask what I wanted. Not once did anyone speak with love. Only practicality. Only self-interest. Only money. I felt physically sick. The people I had spent years helping were quietly planning a future built on my assets. The realization shattered something fundamental inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Trust. Trust shattered. Completely. For several more minutes I listened. Then came the final blow. Rachel laughed softly. Honestly, she'll probably agree if we frame it the right way. Melissa laughed too. And Ethan. Ethan didn't disagree. That hurt most of all. My son? The boy I raised? The boy I protected? The boy whose rent I had quietly paid for years. He sat there listening, participating, allowing the conversation to continue. I stepped away before they could see me. My legs felt weak. I walked to my car, got inside, closed the door, and cried harder than I had cried since Robert's funeral. Not because they wanted my house, not because they discussed assisted living, because for the first time, I truly understood my place in their lives. I wasn't being loved. I was being managed, supported only as long as I remained useful, valuable only because of what I could provide. Money, babysitting, property, solutions. And as I sat there gripping the steering wheel, tears streaming down my face, a new feeling emerged beneath the heartbreak. Not sadness, not grief, resolve. For years, I had been reacting, helping, sacrificing, accommodating. Now, for the first time, I was going to start investigating. Because if my children were making plans behind my back, then I needed to know exactly what else they had been hiding. and that investigation would soon lead me to a discovery far worse than I imagined. The morning after I overheard the conversation about assisted living, I made a decision. For the first time in years, I was going to stop reacting emotionally and start looking at facts. Facts couldn't be manipulated. Facts couldn't lie. Facts couldn't pretend to love you while quietly planning around your assets. If my children were discussing my future without me, I needed to understand exactly what was happening behind the scenes. That was how I found myself sitting in the office of Harold Bennett. Harold had been Robert's attorney for over 30 years. He was 72 now, semi-retired, with silver hair and reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose. More importantly, he was one of the few people Robert trusted completely. When I called asking for an appointment, Harold immediately made time for me. The moment I walked into his office, he knew something was wrong. "Lois," he said gently, "you look exhausted." I smiled weakly. "I feel exhausted." We sat down. For a few moments, I wasn't sure where to begin. Then everything poured out. The birthday dinner, the insults, the discussion about assisted living, the plans for my house, the years of financial support, the rent payments. By the time I finished speaking, Harold looked deeply troubled. He removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair. "That's a lot to carry alone." A lump formed in my throat. "I think I've been lying to myself for years." Harold nodded slowly. "That happens when love and guilt become tangled together." The statement hit harder than I expected, because deep down, I knew he was right. I had spent years convincing myself that sacrifice equaled love, that giving more would somehow earn appreciation. Instead, it had created entitlement. Harold opened a folder. "Let's start with the practical issues." That was exactly what I needed. Practical, objective, clear, no emotions, no excuses, just facts. For the next hour, we reviewed everything: my bank accounts, my retirement funds, the trust Robert had established before his death, property records, insurance documents, investment accounts. The sheer volume of paperwork surprised even me. Robert had always been meticulous. Every document was organized, every asset accounted for, every detail planned. As we worked through the files, I noticed something. Financially, I was far more secure than my children realized. Not wealthy enough to live extravagantly, but secure enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. Suddenly, I understood why Robert had been so careful. He hadn't been planning for himself. He'd been planning for me, even after his death. The realization brought tears to my eyes. Harold noticed. "He loved you very much." I nodded silently. Then we moved on to the lease documents, the documents connected to Ethan's house. Harold reviewed them carefully. His expression darkened. "Lois, do you realize how much liability you've assumed here? I know I'm the guarantor." "No." He pointed at the paperwork. "You aren't simply guaranteeing the lease." He flipped through several pages. "You're essentially protecting your son from the consequences of default." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means if Ethan stops paying, you're responsible." "I already knew that." Harold shook his head. "You don't understand. This arrangement has been renewed repeatedly." He tapped the documents. "The landlord clearly relies on your financial standing more than Ethan's." A knot formed in my stomach. That wasn't what Ethan had told me. Every year he claimed things were improving. Every year he promised the support would end soon. Apparently, the paperwork told a different story. Then Harold asked an unexpected question. "Do you have access to all accounts connected to these arrangements?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Any shared access, online authorizations, digital permissions." I thought about it. Years earlier, Ethan had helped me set up online banking. At the time, I struggled with some of the technology. He had assisted with passwords, security settings, electronic signatures. I hadn't thought much about it. Harold's expression immediately changed. "When was the last time you reviewed those permissions?" My stomach tightened. "I don't know." "Let's check." Over the next 30 minutes, we reviewed every account, every authorization, every digital signature record. At first, everything seemed normal. Then Harold suddenly stopped. His eyes narrowed. "What is this?" The tone in his voice instantly alarmed me. He turned the monitor toward me. A document appeared on the screen. I didn't recognize it. At least not immediately. Harold opened the file, and my blood ran cold. It was a loan application, a substantial one, several $1,000s. My name appeared throughout the paperwork. My information, my financial history, my digital signature. Except I had never seen the document before, never signed it, never approved it. For several seconds I couldn't speak. I simply stared, certain there had to be some explanation, some mistake, some misunderstanding. Then Harold quietly asked the question I was afraid to hear. "Did you authorize this?" "No." The word came out as a whisper. He studied the file again. The timestamp, the approval chain, the electronic verification, everything. Finally, he looked up. "Lois, someone used your digital credentials." I felt physically ill. "No." Harold didn't respond immediately. He was too careful for that, too professional. But his silence said enough. My mind raced. Who had access? Who knew the passwords? Who had helped configure the accounts? The answer arrived instantly. Ethan. The room seemed to spin. "No," I repeated. Not because I doubted the evidence, because I couldn't accept it. My son wouldn't do that. Would he? The question lingered painfully. Then another memory surfaced. Several years earlier, Ethan had called asking questions about electronic forms, online signatures, identity verification. At the time, I barely paid attention. I trusted him completely. Now every conversation suddenly looked different. Every request, every explanation, every excuse. Harold spoke carefully. "I'm not saying your son committed fraud." The pause that followed was deafening. "But someone clearly used your credentials." I covered my mouth. Tears filled my eyes. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about trust. Trust I'd given freely. Trust that may have been exploited. For years, Harold handed me a tissue. "Do you want to pursue this?" I stared at the document. Legally, I probably could. The evidence was serious, potentially very serious. But despite everything, Ethan was still my son. I wasn't ready to destroy his life. Not yet. "No," Harold nodded. "I thought you might say that." Then he leaned forward. "However, I strongly recommend something else." "What?" "Remove every authorization." His voice became firm. "Every password. Every digital permission. Every access point." Today, I knew he was right. The woman who walked into his office that morning would have hesitated. The woman sitting there now didn't. Something had changed. The conversation about assisted living, the discussion of my house, the secret loan. Together they had shattered years of denial. I finally understood something painful. Love doesn't require blindness. Protecting someone doesn't mean allowing them to exploit you. And being a mother doesn't mean surrendering every boundary. Before leaving, Harold showed me one final document: the guarantor agreement, the lease protection, the arrangement supporting Ethan's housing situation. I studied the page quietly. Then I looked up. "Can I end this?" Harold nodded. "Yes." The answer stunned me. What would happen? After proper notice, he closed the folder. "Your obligation ends." I sat silently. Years of monthly payments, years of sacrifices, years of protection, all connected to a single signature. And with another signature, it could stop. For the first time, I realized I held more power than anyone believed, including Ethan, including Rachel, including me. As I left Harold's office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, not peace, clarity. And clarity can be dangerous. Because once you finally see the truth, pretending becomes impossible. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table. In front of me was a blank sheet of paper. I stared at it for nearly an hour. Then I picked up a pen. Because I had just made the most difficult decision of my life. And the first sentence of that letter would change everything. The blank sheet of paper sat in front of me for nearly an hour. I started writing, stopped, crossed things out. Started again. No matter what words I chose, nothing felt right. How do you tell your own child that you're done carrying them? How do you explain that years of love have finally run out of excuses? Eventually, I stopped trying to write the perfect letter. I wrote the honest one. The final version was surprisingly short. Only a few sentences, no accusations, no anger, no dramatic speeches, just truth. It read, "Ethan, this is the last rent payment I will ever make on your behalf." For years, I convinced myself that helping you was an act of love. Now I realized love should not require endless sacrifice from one person. You once asked me to trust that you would stand on your own feet. It's time for you to do that. Love. Mom. I read it 3 times, then folded it carefully. The simplicity of the message made it even more powerful. There was no room for misunderstanding, no room for negotiation, no room for guilt. For the first time in years, I felt completely certain. The next morning, I transferred the final rent payment. As I clicked the confirmation button, my hands trembled. Not because I doubted the decision, because I understood the consequences. Everything was about to change. Then I mailed the letter. And waited. The waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Days passed, then a week. Nothing happened. No phone calls. No angry messages. No confrontation. At first, I wondered whether the letter had been lost. Then I realized something else. Ethan probably hadn't opened it. That thought should have surprised me. Instead, it made perfect sense. For years, my support had become automatic, expected, invisible. Why would he pay close attention to something he assumed would always continue while Ethan remained unaware? I focused on another task, protecting myself. Harold's warnings continued echoing in my mind. Remove every authorization, every password, every access point. So that's exactly what I did. The process took nearly an entire weekend. Bank accounts, investment accounts, retirement funds, insurance records, online access, security questions, emergency contacts, everything. As I worked through each account, I discovered just how much access Ethan once had. Not enough to freely take money, but enough to view information, enough to understand my finances, enough to monitor things he had no business monitoring. The realization unsettled me, because I couldn't remember giving permission for half of it. Years earlier, I'd trusted him completely. Now that trust felt reckless. Each password change felt symbolic, like closing a door, like reclaiming territory, like taking pieces of my life back one by one. The process wasn't emotional. It was practical, and somehow that made it even more empowering. For the first time in years, my financial world belonged entirely to me again, not to my children, not to their expectations, not to their emergencies, to me. A few days later, another unexpected thing happened. I began sleeping better. At first, I didn't understand why. Then one morning I woke up and realized I hadn't spent the night worrying about Ethan, or Rachel, or rent, or debt, or someone else's problems. The absence of anxiety felt strange, almost unfamiliar. I had carried responsibility for so long that I barely remembered what freedom felt like. Meanwhile, life continued. Rachel called twice asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. I politely declined, not because I wanted revenge, because I needed space. Space to think, space to heal, space to figure out who Lois Johnston was when she wasn't solving everyone else's problems. Then came a Sunday afternoon that changed everything. I was organizing old photo albums in the living room when I found a letter from Robert. Not a formal letter. Just a note he'd written years earlier and tucked inside a family scrapbook. His handwriting instantly brought tears to my eyes. The note was simple, but one sentence stopped me cold. Take care of everyone you love, but never forget that you deserve care too. I read the sentence over and over. Take care of everyone you love, but never forget that you deserve care too. Somehow I'd forgotten that second part. Completely, for years, maybe even decades, the note felt like Robert speaking directly to me across time, reminding me of something essential. Love shouldn't be one-sided, sacrifice shouldn't be endless, and kindness shouldn't require self-destruction. That evening, I sat on the porch holding the note while watching the sunset. For the first time since Robert died, I felt close to him again, not through grief, through wisdom. Then my phone rang. Ethan. My heart skipped. For a moment, I wondered whether he'd finally read the letter. I answered cautiously. Hello. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded normal, casual, relaxed. He hadn't read it. I knew immediately. Hi, Ethan. I wanted to ask something. Of course he did. I almost laughed. What is it? Sophie's college application fees are coming up. There it was. Another request. Another emergency. Another expectation. For a brief moment, the old instinct surfaced. The urge to fix everything. The urge to help. The urge to say yes. Then I remembered the letter, the passwords, the conversations, the assisted living plans, the word burden, and I answered differently. I'm not paying any more expenses. Silence. Absolute silence. Several seconds passed. I could practically hear confusion spreading across his face. What? I'm not paying any more expenses. His tone immediately changed. Mom, it's for Sophie. The guilt tactic, predictable, familiar, effective in the past. Not anymore. I'm sorry. Another silence. Longer this time. Then came frustration. What brought this on? I almost told him. The birthday, the insults, the lies, the betrayal. Instead, I simply said, I think it's time everyone starts handling their own responsibilities. His voice became cold. You know things are difficult right now. The irony nearly took my breath away. Things had been difficult for years, yet somehow the solution was always me. I remained calm. I'm sure you'll figure it out. The call ended shortly afterward, not with understanding, not with gratitude, with irritation. And strangely enough, that reaction confirmed I had made the right decision. Because someone who values your help feels grateful. Someone who feels entitled to it feels angry when it stops. Over the next few weeks, the calls became more frequent. Small requests. Minor favors. Financial hints disguised as conversations. Each time, I politely refused. Not cruelly, not dramatically, simply and consistently. No. At first, nobody seemed alarmed. They assumed I would eventually change my mind. After all, I always had before. What they didn't know was that the final rent payment was already gone. The letter had already been delivered. The protections had already been removed. The countdown had already started. And soon, very soon, an unpaid rent notice would arrive. A phone call from Mr. Thompson would follow. Melissa would learn a secret Ethan had hidden for years. Rachel would discover her financial safety net had disappeared. And my entire family would finally come face to face with a truth they'd ignored for far too long. The burden they complained about had been carrying them all along. The first sign of trouble arrived exactly 23 days after I mailed the letter. I wasn't there when it happened, but later I learned every detail. And according to Melissa, it began with a phone call that completely blindsided her. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She was working from home when her cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Normally, she wouldn't have answered. For some reason, she did. Hello, Mrs. Johnston. Yes. This is Thompson Property Management. Melissa immediately assumed there was some mistake. They'd lived in the house for years. They rarely interacted with the landlord. Certainly not unexpectedly. How can I help you? The representative hesitated. Then came the sentence that changed everything. We're calling regarding the overdue rent balance. Melissa froze. Overdue what? The rent payment. Silence. A long, confused silence. I'm sorry, she finally said. There must be a mistake. There is currently an unpaid balance. The representative sounded professional but firm. Melissa laughed nervously. That's impossible. It isn't. The representative then provided the account details. Dates, amounts, records, everything. By the end of the conversation, Melissa wasn't laughing anymore. She was terrified, because as far as she knew, Ethan paid the rent every month. That was what he'd always told her. That was what she'd always believed. The moment the call ended, she immediately phoned her husband. According to Ethan, he nearly drove off the road, because unlike Melissa, he knew exactly what had happened. The final payment had already been made. The next one never arrived, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered the unopened letter sitting on his desk. The letter he still hadn't read. That evening, Melissa confronted him. The argument started quietly, then exploded. Neither of them realized Rachel would soon be facing a similar crisis. But first came Ethan's reckoning. "What do you mean the rent wasn't paid?" Melissa stood in the kitchen holding her phone. Her face was pale. Ethan immediately started searching for excuses. Bank error, processing delay, administrative mistake. Anything, everything. Nothing sounded convincing. Finally, Melissa asked the obvious question. "Can you show me the payment?" Cornered. Trapped. Out of options. Ethan finally did something he hadn't done in years. He told part of the truth, not all of it, part of it, and even that nearly destroyed his marriage. "You don't understand." Melissa stared. "Then explain it." Ethan rubbed both hands across his face, the way he always did when panic started taking over. "It's complicated." "No." Melissa's voice rose. "It's not complicated." She slammed her phone onto the counter. Either the rent was paid or it wasn't. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he made the mistake that changed everything. He mentioned my name. Melissa immediately noticed. What does Lois have to do with this? Another silence. And in that silence, the truth finally emerged. Not all at once. Slowly. Painfully. Like pulling broken glass from a wound. By the end of the conversation, Melissa learned something that shattered her understanding of the last several years. I had been paying the rent. Not once. Not twice. For years. Years. The revelation left her speechless. According to Ethan, she sat down and simply stared at him, as though she were looking at a stranger. "You've been lying to me." He tried defending himself. Tried explaining. Tried justifying. Nothing helped. Because there was no explanation capable of making that situation reasonable. He had allowed his wife to believe he was supporting the family. Meanwhile, his 70-year-old mother had been carrying a burden he never admitted existed. The fight lasted hours. Melissa cried, yelled, demanded answers. Ethan offered excuses. By midnight, neither of them were speaking. The next morning, he finally opened my letter. And for the first time, he understood that the payments were truly over. There would be no rescue, no extension, no last-minute solution. Meanwhile, another storm was forming, this time around Rachel. Unlike Ethan, Rachel wasn't dependent on rent assistance. Her dependency looked different. Credit cards, personal loan, unexpected expenses. For years, whenever things became difficult, she called me. And somehow the problem disappeared. What Rachel didn't realize was that those rescues had ended too. 3 days after Melissa's discovery, Rachel called me. I already knew why. The moment I saw her name on my phone, I knew. Still, I answered. "Hello." "Mom." Her voice sounded strained. "Hi, Rachel. I need help." Straight to the point. No small talk. No concern. No curiosity about how I was doing. Just need. Always need. I waited. Eventually she continued. "My credit card company froze my account." I said nothing. "They're demanding payment." Still nothing. Then came the familiar request. "Can you loan me a few $1,000s loan?" The word almost made me smile. Neither of us believed it was a loan. It never had been. For years, every loan quietly transformed into a gift. Not this time. I'm sorry, Rachel. Silence. What? I'm not helping financially anymore, and the reaction was immediate. What are you talking about? Her voice rose. I remained calm. I think it's time you handled your own finances. The sentence landed like an explosion. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Then came anger. Real anger. Where is this coming from? I thought about the birthday. The conversations. The plans for my house. The assisted living discussions. The lies. Instead, I simply answered, "It's a decision I've made." Rachel hung up on me. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. Yet somehow it marked the end of a pattern that had lasted years. Within 48 hours, she called back. Then again. Then again. Each conversation followed the same path. Confusion, frustration, anger, and eventually blame. Always blame. Never reflection. Never accountability. Never gratitude. Just blame. The situation deteriorated quickly. By the following week, both Ethan and Rachel were in trouble. Real trouble. The kind that couldn't be solved by pretending. The kind that couldn't be hidden. The kind that exposed uncomfortable truths. And suddenly, something remarkable happened. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls, texts, voicemails, messages. Every family member suddenly remembered I existed. Ethan called 6 times in one day. Rachel left emotional voicemails. Melissa even attempted to contact me directly. The irony wasn't lost on me. For nearly a week after my birthday, nobody noticed my silence. Now that money had stopped flowing, everyone wanted my attention. The realization hurt, but it also strengthened my resolve, because for the first time, I could clearly see the difference between love and dependency. And my family wasn't responding to the loss of affection. They were responding to the loss of resources. One evening, I sat on my porch watching the sunset when another call came. This time from Sophie. My heart softened immediately. I answered, "Hi, sweetheart." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Grandma, is it true you've been paying our rent?" I closed my eyes, so she knew now too. The secret was gone. The truth had finally reached everyone. And once truths escape, they rarely stop moving. Because what Sophie said next would prove that the situation inside Ethan's house was becoming far worse than anyone realized. Much worse. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the collapse I was witnessing wasn't just financial. It was moral. The entire foundation of my family was cracking. And soon, all of us would be forced to face what was hiding underneath. When Ethan, Rachel, and Melissa finally came to my house, they didn't come separately. They came together. That alone told me everything I needed to know. People who truly want reconciliation usually come with humility. People looking for solutions often come with questions. My children arrived with anger. It was a Saturday afternoon. I had just finished watering the flowers Robert planted years ago when I saw 3 vehicles pull into my driveway. For a brief moment, I considered going inside and locking the door. Not because I was afraid, because I already knew what was coming. Still, I stayed. Some conversations cannot be avoided forever. The 3 of them stepped out almost immediately. Ethan led the way. Rachel followed. Melissa walked behind them with crossed arms and a tense expression. Nobody smiled. Nobody greeted me. Nobody asked how I was doing. The confrontation began before they even reached the porch. "Mom, what is going on?" Ethan's voice was sharp, accusatory, not curious, not concerned, accusatory. I calmly set down the watering can. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." There it was. The entitlement. The assumption that I owed explanations before receiving basic respect. I looked at all three of them. "Would you like to come inside?" Rachel sighed dramatically. "Can we skip the games? The word nearly made me laugh. For years, I had financed their lives, protected their secrets, saved them from consequences. Now they were accusing me of playing games. I opened the front door. "Come in." The atmosphere inside felt tense immediately. Nobody sat comfortably. Nobody relaxed. It felt less like a family visit and more like a legal dispute, which, in many ways, it had become. Eventually, Ethan spoke first. "Melissa knows everything now." I nodded. "I assumed she would." Melissa shook her head. "No." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know your son was lying to me for years." That was the first honest statement anyone had made since arriving. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then Rachel jumped in. "You can't just cut everyone off without warning." I stared at her. The irony was unbelievable. Without warning, I thought about the birthday dinner, the assisted living conversation, the plans for my house, the years of being treated like an inconvenience. Without warning. I had received plenty of warning. They simply hadn't noticed. "I didn't cut anyone off." Rachel laughed bitterly. "Really?" I walked to my desk, opened a drawer, removed a folder, then another, then another. The room grew quiet, because suddenly everyone realized this wasn't going to be an emotional argument. It was going to be a factual one. I returned to the table, placed the folders in front of them. Nobody touched them at first. "What is this?" Ethan asked. "Documentation." His expression changed immediately. I opened the first folder. Bank statements, years of payments, dates, amounts, transfers, every dollar I had sent, every rent payment, every emergency bailout, every credit card rescue, every check, every transfer, everything. The silence became deafening. Melissa slowly flipped through the pages. The color drained from her face. "Oh my God!" Rachel stopped talking entirely. Even Ethan looked stunned. Not because the information was new, because for the first time, everyone else could see it. All of it. The second folder contained lease documents, guarantee agreements, renewals, payment records, Mr. Thompson's paperwork. Melissa's hands visibly trembled. "You guaranteed our lease." I nodded. "For years." She looked at Ethan. The expression on her face wasn't anger anymore. It was betrayal. Pure betrayal. "You told me we were fine." Ethan couldn't meet her eyes. The room remained silent. Then I opened the third folder. This one changed everything. The loan application. The unauthorized electronic signature. The document Harold had shown me. The moment Ethan saw it, I watched his face collapse. He knew. Immediately. Nobody else understood yet. But he did. "Ethan," I said quietly. For the first time all afternoon, my voice carried genuine disappointment. Not anger. Disappointment. "Would you like to explain this?" Rachel looked confused. Melissa looked confused. Ethan looked trapped. Several long seconds passed. Nobody spoke. Then Melissa grabbed the document. "What is this?" Still silence. She read further. Then her eyes widened. "Is this Lois's information?" No response. "Ethan." Nothing. "Ethan." Finally he spoke. "It wasn't what it looks like." The oldest excuse in human history, and usually the weakest. I closed my eyes briefly. Years ago, I would have rushed to protect him. Not anymore. Melissa continued reading. The truth became obvious. The digital signature. The financial information. The authorization trail. Everything. When she finally looked up, tears filled her eyes. "You used your mother's information." Ethan buried his face in his hands. The answer was obvious. Nobody needed him to say it aloud. The evidence said enough. Rachel looked horrified. For perhaps the first time in years, she seemed genuinely speechless. Then she whispered, "Ethan, please tell me you didn't—" His silence confirmed everything. The room fell completely quiet. The only sound came from the grandfather clock in my living room. Tick, tick, tick. Each second seemed louder than the last. Eventually, Ethan looked up. His eyes were red. I was desperate. The confession finally arrived. Not because he wanted honesty, because he no longer had options. I thought I could fix everything before anyone found out. I stared at him. The strange thing was that I believed him, not because it excused anything, because desperation often leads people to terrible decisions. That didn't make those decisions acceptable, only understandable. Rachel shook her head. "Oh my God." Melissa looked like she wanted to disappear. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. The moment nobody expected. I reached into the final folder and removed another document, my updated will. The reaction was immediate. Rachel noticed first. Her eyes widened. "What's that?" I met her gaze. "My new estate plan." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I continued calmly. "A few weeks ago, I made some changes." The room became still. Completely still. The kind of silence that only exists when people fear what they're about to hear. Rachel swallowed hard. Ethan looked exhausted. Melissa stared at the table. I took a slow breath. Then I finally said the words that changed everything. "The inheritance you were expecting no longer exists in the form you imagined." Shock spread across every face. Instantly. For years they had spoken about my house, my assets, my future, as though those things already belonged to them. Now they were learning something important. Nothing belonged to them. Not until I chose. Not until I was gone. Not until I said so. For the first time in years, the balance of power shifted. Not because I wanted revenge, and because truth had finally entered the room. Then I looked directly at Ethan. "I know about the assisted living conversations." His face went white. Rachel gasped. Melissa looked up immediately. Nobody denied it. "Nobody could," I continued. "I know about the plans for the house." More silence. "I know about the discussions regarding my future." The guilt on their faces said everything. Finally, after weeks of confusion, pain, and betrayal, I asked the question that had haunted me since my birthday. "Was I ever your mother?" My voice trembled. Despite everything, despite all my preparation, despite all my resolve. That question hurt. Or was I simply the person paying your bills? Nobody answered. Because there was no answer that could undo years of choices. And for the first time, All three of them were being forced to confront exactly what those choices had cost. Nobody spoke after my question. The silence stretched across the room like a crack in glass. Was I ever your mother, I had asked, or was I simply the person paying your bills? No one had an answer. Because deep down, they all knew why. The truth was uncomfortable, painful, and impossible to argue with. Eventually, Rachel looked away first. Melissa stared at the floor. Ethan remained frozen in his chair. For the first time in years, nobody was blaming me. Nobody was making excuses. Nobody was demanding anything. They were simply sitting with the consequences of their choices. After several minutes, Ethan finally stood. His shoulders looked heavier than I had ever seen them. We should go. Melissa didn't argue. Rachel didn't either. One by one, they left. No dramatic confrontation. No shouting. No apologies. Just silence. The front door closed. And suddenly, the house felt very empty. I expected relief. Instead, I felt grief. Not because they were gone. Because I finally understood how broken things had become. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house carrying a cup of tea. Every room contained memories. Good memories. Painful memories. Life memories. I eventually found myself standing in Robert's old workshop. He had spent countless hours there, building furniture, fixing things, creating gifts for the grandchildren. The room still smelled faintly of wood and machine oil, a smell I associated with safety, with stability, with him. As I looked around, my eyes landed on an old storage cabinet. I hadn't opened it in years. Inside were dozens of folders, financial records, insurance documents, personal notes, letters. Robert had always documented everything. Curious, I began sorting through them. Most of the contents were exactly what I expected. Tax records, investment summaries, property paperwork. Then I discovered a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front, in Robert's handwriting. My heart immediately began racing. I carefully opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 6 months before his death. My hands trembled as I unfolded the pages. The first sentence nearly brought me to tears. If you're reading this, I probably worried about you more than I needed to. That sounded exactly like Robert. Always protective. Always thinking ahead. I sat down and continued reading. The letter wasn't about money. Not really. It was about me. About the future. About what he hoped for after he was gone. Then I reached a paragraph that stopped me cold. Lois, if there's one thing I need you to remember, it's this: our children are adults. Help them when you choose to. Love them always. But never sacrifice your entire life trying to rescue them from every consequence. I stared at the words, over and over, reading them repeatedly. The message felt almost prophetic, as though Robert somehow knew exactly what would happen. Then came another paragraph, one that hit even harder. I worry that your kindness will become a target someday. Not because our children are bad people, but because dependence changes people. It slowly teaches them to expect what once felt like a gift. Tears rolled down my cheeks. Because he had seen it, years before it happened. He had understood something I refused to acknowledge. Dependence changes people. Not overnight. Gradually. Quietly. Until gratitude disappears. until expectations replace appreciation. Until love becomes tangled with entitlement. I sat in that workshop for nearly 2 hours, reading, crying, remembering. And for the first time since Robert died, I felt as though he was sitting beside me. Not physically, emotionally, guiding me, helping me understand. The next morning, I called Harold Bennett. I found one of Robert's letters. Harold immediately understood why I was emotional. He and Robert had been friends for decades. He was a smart man. I laughed softly through tears, apparently smarter than I realized. Harold invited me to lunch. During the meal, we talked about Robert, not legal matters, not finances, just Robert, the man I loved, the husband I missed, the father my children seemed to have forgotten. At one point, Harold leaned back and smiled. "You know what Robert told me once?" I shook my head. He said his biggest fear wasn't dying. My chest tightened. What was it? Harold's smile faded. He worried you would spend the rest of your life taking care of everyone except yourself. I stared at him, speechless, because that was exactly what had happened. Exactly. For years, Harold continued. He loved your children, I know. But he also knew their weaknesses. I nodded slowly. We all knew their weaknesses. The difference was that Robert understood something I didn't. Protecting someone from consequences doesn't eliminate the weakness. It strengthens it. The conversation stayed with me long after lunch ended, and apparently, similar conversations were happening elsewhere. Conversations inside Ethan's house. Conversations that were far less comfortable. 3 days later, Sophie called again. This time she sounded upset. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." "Mom and Dad are fighting constantly." My heart sank. I had feared this, not because I wanted them to suffer, because hidden truths rarely stay hidden forever. And when they emerge, they tend to damage everything around them. Sophie explained that Melissa had discovered additional lies, credit card balances, personal loans, financial problems Ethan had hidden. The situation was spiraling. Apparently, Melissa wasn't just angry about the rent. She was questioning everything. And honestly, I couldn't blame her. Trust is difficult to rebuild once it's broken, especially when the lies stretch across years. Then Sophie shared something else. Something unexpected. "Grandma, yes, Dad cried." The statement surprised me. Not because men don't cry, because Ethan rarely allowed himself vulnerability. "What happened?" "He thought nobody was watching." Her voice softened. "I heard him talking about Grandpa." I closed my eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Sophie quietly added, "He said Grandpa would be ashamed of him." That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Because maybe Ethan was finally confronting reality. Maybe. Or maybe he simply regretted getting caught. I honestly didn't know. The distinction mattered. Real remorse creates change. Embarrassment creates excuses. Only time would reveal which one he felt. A week later, Rachel called unexpectedly. For once, she wasn't asking for money. She wasn't angry either. She sounded exhausted, completely exhausted. "I found out something." My stomach tightened. "What?" "Do you remember how Dad always talked about responsibility?" I laughed softly. "Of course," Rachel began crying. Actual crying. Not manipulation. Not frustration. pain. We forgot everything he taught us. The confession shocked me, because it was the first genuinely self-aware statement I had heard from either of my children in years. For several minutes, Rachel talked about debt, about bad decisions, about entitlement, about how easy it became to depend on someone else's rescue. I listened quietly, not because everything was suddenly fixed, far from it, but because for the first time, one of my children seemed willing to examine their own behavior, not mine, theirs. When the call ended, I sat quietly on my porch. The sun was beginning to set. The maple trees Robert planted swayed gently in the evening breeze. And for the first time since everything exploded, I felt something unexpected. Not forgiveness, not yet. Hope, tiny, fragile, incomplete, but real, because maybe Robert had been right all along. Maybe dependence had changed my children, but perhaps responsibility could change them back. The question was whether they were willing to pay the price. And very soon that price would become painfully clear. Hope can be a dangerous thing. When Rachel called and admitted she had forgotten everything Robert taught us, a small part of me wanted to believe the worst was over. I wanted to believe my children had finally learned something. I wanted to believe accountability had arrived, but life rarely changes that quickly, especially when people spend years avoiding responsibility. The truth was that Ethan and Rachel weren't facing a temporary inconvenience. They were facing the collapse of an entire way of living. And collapse is never graceful. 3 weeks after our confrontation at my house, Ethan's life began unraveling in ways he could no longer hide. I didn't hear it from him. I heard it from Sophie. By then, she had started calling me regularly. Not because she needed money, not because she wanted something, because she was scared. One evening, she called while I was preparing dinner. "Grandma." Her voice sounded shaky. I immediately put down the knife I was holding. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. Then she quietly said, "Dad lost his job." I closed my eyes. Part of me wasn't surprised. Part of me had been expecting something like this. What happened, according to Sophie, the situation had been building for months. Missed deadlines, poor performance, stress, distraction, financial problems, lies. The pressure had finally caught up with him. Eventually, his employer decided they couldn't rely on him anymore. Just like that, the job was gone. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Ethan had portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances. Now circumstances were demanding something from him, responsibility, and he wasn't prepared. A few days later, I learned the situation inside the Johnston household had become explosive. Melissa had reached her limit. The lies about rent were only the beginning. As she reviewed their finances, more secrets emerged. Old debts, hidden balances, missed payments, loans she never knew existed. Each discovery damaged the marriage further. One afternoon, Melissa called me directly. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. When I picked up, she immediately started crying. Not yelling, not blaming, crying, and somehow that was harder to hear. For years, I had viewed Melissa as part of the problem. Now I realized she had been deceived too. Maybe not innocent, but deceived. "I don't even know who I'm married to anymore." Her voice cracked. I remained silent. Sometimes people don't need advice. They need someone willing to listen. For nearly 20 minutes, Melissa talked about trust, about betrayal, about fear, about bills, about uncertainty. Eventually, she asked a question, one that surprised me. How did you keep helping him for so long? I looked out the kitchen window. The answer was painfully simple. Because I loved him. Silence. Then Melissa whispered, "So did I." That sentence stayed with me. Because love wasn't the problem. The problem was what we allowed love to justify. Meanwhile, Rachel's situation wasn't much better. Without my financial rescues, reality arrived quickly. Collection notices, late fees, overdue balances, consequences she'd postponed for years. At first, she reacted exactly as I expected. Anger, denial, excuses. Everything was someone else's fault. The economy, her employer, her ex-husband, bad luck, anything except herself. Then one morning something changed. She received notice that legal action might begin on one of her debts. For the first time, panic broke through the denial, and suddenly excuses stopped working. A week later, she appeared at my front door, alone. No Ethan, no Melissa, no agenda that I could immediately see. When I opened the door, she looked exhausted. Dark circles beneath her eyes, shoulders slumped. No makeup, no confidence, just exhaustion. For a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to crawl into my lap after bad dreams. "Can we talk?" I nodded. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd eaten countless meals growing up. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel surprised me. "I owe you an apology." The words came slowly, awkwardly, as though she'd never said them before. Maybe she hadn't. I waited. "I spent years assuming you'd always fix everything." Tears appeared in her eyes. "And I never thought about what that was doing to you." I remained silent, not because I wanted to punish her, because she needed to finish. For nearly an hour, Rachel talked about mistakes, poor choices, avoidance, dependency, fear. For once, there were no excuses, only honesty. When she finally finished, she looked emotionally drained. Then she asked, "Do you think Dad would be disappointed in me?" The question broke my heart, not because I knew the answer, because I knew she already did. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your father would be disappointed in your choices." She nodded. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Then I continued, "But he'd be proud that you're finally facing them." Rachel cried openly after that. Years of denial, years of avoidance, years of dependence, finally cracking. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was the beginning. The harder situation remained Ethan. Unlike Rachel, he still seemed trapped between guilt and self-pity. Some days he accepted responsibility. Other days he blamed everyone else, especially me. According to Sophie, his moods changed constantly. One day he promised to rebuild. The next day he complained that I'd abandoned him. The inconsistency worried me, because true change requires consistency, not occasional regret. Then something happened that shocked even me. Sophie showed up at my house unexpectedly, alone. When I opened the door, she looked nervous, almost frightened. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She stepped inside. For several moments she struggled to find the words. Then she finally spoke. "What happens when people get addicted to being rescued?" The question stunned me, not because it was complicated, because it was so perceptive, so mature, so painfully accurate. I looked at my granddaughter, suddenly realizing she understood far more than anyone realized. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "I think Dad doesn't know how to live without someone saving him." The statement hung in the air. Neither of us moved. Because deep down, I knew she was right. For years I'd rescued Ethan. Before that, Robert had. Whenever life became difficult, someone stepped in. Someone solved the problem. Someone absorbed the consequences. As a result, Ethan never developed the muscles needed to carry his own burdens. And now those muscles were being tested for the first time. The process was ugly, painful, necessary. Then Sophie revealed something that made my stomach drop. A secret she had been carrying. One she wasn't sure whether to tell me. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Grandma." "Yes." "Dad wanted to use my name for a student loan application." I froze. "What?" Her eyes filled with tears. "He said it would help the family." The room suddenly felt cold, very cold. For several seconds I couldn't speak, because I finally understood how desperate things had become. This wasn't simply financial trouble anymore. It was a pattern of using other people's stability to avoid personal responsibility. First me, now Sophie. The realization broke something inside me. Not anger, sadness, deep sadness, because my son had become someone I barely recognized. And unless something changed soon, he was going to lose far more than money. He was going to lose the trust of everyone who still loved him, including his daughter. After Sophie told me about the student loan application, I sat alone in my living room for a long time. The house was quiet, too quiet. Outside, the wind moved gently through Robert's maple trees. Inside, I couldn't stop thinking about my son. Not the man he had become. The boy he used to be. The little boy who once cried because he found an injured bird in the backyard. The teenager who spent an entire summer mowing lawns to save money for his first car. The young father who cried when Sophie was born. Where had that version of Ethan gone? Or perhaps a more painful question lingered beneath the surface. Had he ever truly disappeared? Maybe he had simply gotten lost beneath years of fear, pride, and bad decisions. I didn't know. And honestly, I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. Because regardless of the reason, the damage was real. The trust was broken. The consequences were unavoidable. 3 days later, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, Sophie stood there, alone. Her backpack hung from one shoulder. Her eyes were red, not from crying, from exhaustion. She looked older than 19. The kind of older that comes from carrying worries that shouldn't belong to someone her age. "Hi, Grandma." I immediately stepped aside. "Come in, sweetheart." The moment she entered, I knew this wasn't a casual visit. Something had changed. Something important. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Robert and I had helped her with homework years ago. The same table where we baked cookies together. The same table where life had once felt simple. For several minutes, Sophie stared at her hands. Then she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." My heart tightened. "Sophie, no." She shook her head. "I really do." Tears filled her eyes, and suddenly the words began pouring out. Not carefully, not strategically, honestly. "I laughed at jokes about you." She looked down. "I ignored your calls. Another tear rolled down her cheek. I acted like everyone else. I remained silent because she wasn't finished, and because I could see how difficult this was. I never asked where the money came from. She swallowed hard. I never asked why you were always helping. Her voice cracked. I just accepted it. The room became very quiet. I reached across the table and gently took her hand. Sophie. She immediately started crying. Real crying. The kind that comes from genuine regret. Not embarrassment. Not self-pity. Regret. I feel awful. The words came out between sobs. I thought you were just there. That sentence broke my heart. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest. For years, I had been just there, always available, always helping, always solving problems. People rarely appreciate something they assume will never disappear. That's exactly what had happened. Not just with Sophie, with everyone. Eventually, she wiped her eyes. Then she said something unexpected. You know what's weird? What? She laughed softly through tears. I didn't really know you. I frowned. What do you mean? She looked around the kitchen. The family photographs, the bookshelves, the old furniture, the framed pictures of Robert, everything. I knew Grandma. She paused. But I didn't know Lois. The observation stunned me, because she was right. For years, I had existed primarily as a role. Mother, grandmother, caretaker, problem solver, support system. Few people had bothered to know me beyond those functions. Even I had forgotten parts of myself. Then Sophie surprised me again. What did you want before all this? I blinked. What? Your life. She smiled sadly. What did you want? The question caught me completely off guard, because nobody had asked it in years, maybe decades. I sat quietly, thinking, remembering. Finally, I answered. I wanted to travel. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? I nodded. Your grandfather and I used to talk about seeing the Great Lakes. A smile touched my lips. Michigan, Wisconsin, Maine, maybe even Alaska someday. Sophie smiled. For the first time that afternoon, genuine warmth appeared in her expression. What else? The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours. Books, dreams, memories, stories about Robert, stories about my childhood, stories nobody had asked me to tell in years. And somewhere during that conversation, something beautiful happened. For the first time in a very long time, I felt seen, not as a wallet, not as a rescuer, not as a burden, as a person, simply a person. When Sophie finally stood to leave, she hesitated. Then she wrapped her arms around me. The hug lasted much longer than usual, and when she stepped back, she looked relieved, lighter somehow, as though telling the truth had freed her. Then she said something that changed everything. There's one more thing. My stomach tightened. What is it? She looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. I wasn't supposed to tell anyone. Immediately, I knew this wasn't going to be good. Sophie, she took a deep breath, then finally spoke. Dad wanted to put one of the college loans in my name. Even though she had mentioned it before, hearing the full story felt different, much worse. What exactly happened? Sophie explained everything. The discussions, the paperwork, the pressure, the promises. Apparently Ethan had insisted it would help everyone. that it wasn't really a big deal, that families supported each other. As she described the conversation, my heart sank, because the language sounded familiar. Very familiar. It was the same logic Ethan had used with me for years. The same rationalizations. The same emotional pressure. The same avoidance of responsibility. Only now the target wasn't me. It was his daughter. The realization filled me with sadness. Not anger. Sadness. Because I finally understood how deeply the pattern had spread. Dependency wasn't just hurting Ethan anymore. It was threatening the next generation. Then Sophie said something that surprised me. I told him no. I stared at her. You did? She nodded. I almost said yes. Her voice trembled. But then I thought about you. Tears filled my eyes. You did. She smiled softly. You were the first person who ever showed me that loving someone doesn't mean giving them everything they ask for. For several seconds, I couldn't speak, because those words meant more than she could possibly understand. All those years, all that pain, all those sacrifices. Maybe they hadn't been entirely wasted. Maybe one person had learned something valuable after all. When Sophie finally left, I stood on the porch watching her drive away. For the first time in months, I felt genuine peace. Not because everything was fixed, far from it. Ethan was still struggling. Rachel still had debts. The family remained fractured. But Sophie represented something different, a new direction. A chance to break the cycle. That evening, I received an email. The sender's name immediately caught my attention. Ethan Johnston. I stared at the screen for several moments, then opened the message. The first sentence made my heart stop. Mom, I think I've finally reached the point where I can tell you the truth. And as I continued reading, I realized my son was about to confess something he had hidden for years. Something that explained far more than I ever imagined. I stared at Ethan's email for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Part of me wanted to delete it. Part of me wasn't ready to hear another excuse, another explanation, another attempt to avoid responsibility. But another part of me, the mother part, needed to know, needed to understand. So I opened it. The email wasn't long. In fact, it was surprisingly short. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. Mom, I don't think I've been honest with myself for a very long time. I kept reading. With every paragraph, a different picture of my son began to emerge. Not a better picture, not a worse one, a more complete one. Ethan admitted something I never expected. His financial problems hadn't started when he lost his job. They had started years before, long before. The job loss had only exposed them. Apparently, Ethan had spent most of his adult life terrified of failure, terrified of looking unsuccessful, terrified of appearing weak. He wanted the nice neighborhood. The larger house, the newer cars, the vacations, the appearance of stability, even when reality couldn't support it, especially when reality couldn't support it. The pressure became a cycle. When money became tight, he borrowed. When borrowing wasn't enough, he hid things. When hiding things became difficult, he lied. When lies created consequences, he looked for rescue. And every time I stepped in, the cycle continued. Not because I caused it, because I unintentionally made it easier to avoid. Then I reached a sentence that brought tears to my eyes. I stopped seeing your help as help. I stared at the screen, reading the sentence repeatedly. I stopped seeing your help as help. That was it. The entire tragedy reduced to one simple truth. Gratitude had disappeared. Expectation replaced it. Ethan continued, I convinced myself you wanted to do it. You were always there. So I stopped thinking about what it cost you. The honesty hurt, but somehow it also felt necessary. Like cleaning a wound. Painful, yet required. The email ended with a sentence that surprised me. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know the truth. No request, no demand, no financial emergency, no manipulation, just truth. When I finished reading, I sat quietly in my kitchen. For a long time, I didn't know whether to cry, or laugh, or scream. Because after everything that happened, the truth felt almost ordinary. No secret gambling addiction, no criminal conspiracy, no hidden second family, just fear, years and years of fear. Fear disguised as pride, fear disguised as success, fear disguised as control, and fear had nearly destroyed everything. 3 days later, Ethan knocked on my door, alone. When I opened it, I barely recognized him. He looked thinner, older, tired, not physically, emotionally. The confidence he carried for years was gone. The defensiveness, too. For the first time in a very long time, he simply looked human. Can we talk? I nodded. We sat on the porch. The same porch where Robert and I once spent summer evenings watching sunsets. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan surprised me. I sold the truck. I blinked. The truck, he nodded. The truck had been his pride and joy, expensive and impractical. One of many purchases that never made financial sense. It helped pay some debts. I remained quiet. Then he continued. We moved. That caught me off guard. What? He looked away. We couldn't afford the rental anymore. The words hung heavily between us. The house, the one I'd helped preserve for years, gone, not through eviction, not through disaster, through reality. They had moved into a smaller place, cheaper, more manageable, more honest. Oddly enough, I felt relief. Not because they lost the house, because they finally stopped pretending they could afford it. Then Ethan said something unexpected. You know what's strange? What? He laughed softly, without humor. Life is actually simpler now. I looked at him carefully, and for the first time, I believed he meant it. No more juggling lies. No more hiding debts. No more pretending. No more waiting for rescue. Just reality. Difficult. Uncomfortable. Honest. Then came the conversation I never thought we'd have. The conversation about Robert. For years, Ethan rarely mentioned his father, not because he didn't love him, because disappointment lived between those memories. Finally, he spoke. I kept thinking Dad would be angry. I smiled sadly. He probably would have been. Ethan laughed, a genuine laugh, for the first time all afternoon. Yeah, then I added something else. But he would have wanted you to get back up? That was Robert. Always. Accountability first. Redemption second. Never the other way around. Tears appeared in Ethan's eyes. And suddenly I saw the little boy again. The little boy who once scraped his knee and ran to his parents. The little boy who wasn't perfect, just scared. Then he said something I'll never forget. I don't want Sophie to become me. The statement hit me harder than anything else, because finally, after all these months, he understood. This was never about money. Never about rent. Never about inheritance. Never about houses. It was about patterns. Patterns passed from one generation to the next, unless someone stops them. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan was finally ready to stop them. The following weeks brought gradual changes. Not miracles. Changes. Rachel started meeting with a financial counselor. For the first time in her life, she created an actual budget. A real one. Not a fantasy. Not wishful thinking. A budget. Melissa returned to work full-time, not because she had to, because she wanted independence, transparency, control over her future. And Sophie thrived. More than anyone else. She received scholarship assistance, part-time work, academic recognition. Most importantly, she learned a lesson many people never learn. Love and boundaries can exist together. One doesn't cancel the other. Meanwhile, I began changing too. For the first time since Robert died, I started living for myself again. Not selfishly, healthily. I joined a travel group for seniors, took weekend trips, made new friends, started volunteering at a local literacy program. Read books simply because I wanted to, not because I was waiting for someone to need something. The freedom felt strange at first, then wonderful, then necessary. One afternoon, nearly a year after everything began unraveling, Sophie visited again. We sat on the porch drinking lemonade, watching the sunset. Eventually she smiled. "You seem happier." I thought about the question carefully, then nodded. "I think I am." The answer surprised even me, because happiness wasn't what I'd expected. I expected sadness, loneliness, regret. Instead, I found peace, the kind that comes from living honestly. Then Sophie asked, "Do you think we'll ever be a normal family again?" I looked toward the horizon. The sky glowed gold and orange. Beautiful, imperfect, changing, just like families. Finally, I smiled. "No," she laughed. "What?" "We won't be the family we were." Her smile faded slightly. Then I continued. "We might become something better." And for the first time in a very long time, I truly believed it. The following spring, almost 18 months after I stopped paying Ethan's rent, our family gathered for dinner. Not because of a holiday, not because of an emergency, not because someone needed money. Just dinner. A simple dinner. The kind of thing families are supposed to do. I stood in my kitchen that afternoon preparing food and realized something surprising. I wasn't anxious. For years, family gatherings had filled me with tension. Would someone ask for money? Would someone create drama? Would I leave feeling used? This time felt different. Not perfect. Different. The guest list was small. Ethan, Melissa, Rachel, Sophie. Just family. No hidden agendas. At least, I hoped not. By 6 o'clock, everyone had arrived. The atmosphere felt awkward at first. Not hostile. Careful. Like people walking across a frozen lake. Uncertain which steps were safe. I understood. Trust takes years to build. Moments to break. And a very long time to rebuild. We sat around the same dining room table where countless memories had been made. Some beautiful, some painful. For a while, conversation stayed light. Weather, work, travel, books. Normal topics, healthy topics. Then I noticed something. Nobody complained. Nobody asked for money. Nobody talked about emergencies. Nobody treated me like a solution. For the first time in years, I was simply part of the conversation, not the rescue plan, not the bank account, just Lois. That alone felt remarkable. Eventually, Ethan cleared his throat. The room immediately grew quieter, because everyone knew what was coming, including him. He looked nervous. More nervous than I'd seen him in a long time. Then he looked directly at me. "Mom." His voice wavered, just slightly, but enough. I waited. The room remained silent. Then he continued, "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, necessary. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed him. For once, Ethan had nowhere to hide, and he didn't try. I spent years blaming other people for problems I created. His eyes lowered. I blamed circumstances. I blamed employers. I blamed bad luck. He swallowed hard. Sometimes I even blamed you. I felt my chest tighten. Not from anger, from honesty. Real honesty. The kind that hurts because it's true. Ethan continued. But the truth is, he paused, searching for the right words. The truth is that I became dependent. The room remained perfectly still. I stopped acting like an adult. His eyes met mine again. And I treated your love like an obligation. Tears appeared in my eyes, not because the apology erased the past, because it acknowledged it. That mattered. A lot. Then Ethan said something unexpected. "The day you stopped paying our rent saved my life." The statement shocked everyone, even Melissa, even Rachel. He laughed softly. "I hated you for it at first." The honesty drew a few nervous smiles. "But if you hadn't stopped—" He shook his head. "I would have kept lying. I would have kept hiding. I would have kept blaming." Another pause. And Sophie would have learned that behavior from me. The room grew quiet again, because we all knew he was right. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is stop protecting them from consequences. Not because you want them to suffer, because you want them to grow. Melissa spoke next. Something I never expected. "Lois." I looked toward her. Tears filled her eyes. "I owe you an apology, too." For years I had imagined hearing those words. Now that they arrived, they felt strangely gentle, not triumphant, just sad. Melissa wiped her eyes. "I judged you." She laughed softly. "I thought you were overbearing." A few people smiled, including me, because there was some truth in that. Then her expression grew serious. "I never stopped to consider how much you were carrying." Her voice cracked. "And I definitely never thanked you." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The gesture surprised both of us, but it felt right. Rachel spoke next, and somehow her apology hurt the most, because Rachel had always been my daughter, my little girl, the one who used to leave handwritten notes on my pillow, the one who once told me I was her hero. Life had changed both of us, but hearing her speak brought those memories flooding back. I spent years believing I deserved your help. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I never earned it. The room remained silent. Rachel looked directly at me, and I forgot that you're a person. That sentence nearly broke me, because it was the exact wound I had carried all those years. Not being seen, not being valued, not being known. Simply being useful, Rachel continued. I don't know if I can ever make up for that. I smiled softly. You don't have to. The entire table looked towards me, waiting, listening. For the first time, I realized everyone wanted to hear what I would say, not because they needed money, because they needed guidance. The difference mattered, so I took a deep breath and told them the truth. I forgive all of you. Tears appeared instantly around the table, including mine. But before anyone could speak, I continued. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as going backward. That was important, very important, because healing requires clarity, not amnesia. I love all of you. I looked at each face, one by one. I always will. Another pause. But things are different now. Everyone nodded, quietly, understanding. I continued. I will never again sacrifice myself to keep other people comfortable. The statement wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was peaceful, certain, true. No more financial rescues. No more hidden support. No more carrying burdens that belong to someone else. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. Because deep down, they knew I was right. The remarkable thing was that nobody seemed upset. Instead, they seemed relieved, as though honesty itself had become a gift. The conversation continued late into the evening. Stories, memories, laughter, actual laughter, not forced, not nervous, real. At one point, Sophie stood and raised her glass. I want to say something. Everyone turned toward her. She smiled, then looked directly at me. Grandma taught me the most important lesson of my life. I laughed. What lesson is that? Her answer came immediately. Love isn't measured by what you give away. Silence filled the room. Beautiful silence. Then she continued. It's measured by the truth you're willing to tell. Nobody spoke for several seconds, because there was nothing to add. The lesson said everything. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone on the porch. The same porch where Robert and I had spent so many evenings together. The sky above was filled with stars. The maple trees swayed gently in the wind. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. Families are never perfect. People make mistakes. People disappoint each other. People fail. What mattered was what happened afterward. Whether they learned, whether they changed, whether they chose honesty over comfort. As I sat there, I thought about the woman I had been 18 months earlier. The woman standing in a hallway listening to her family call her a burden. That woman believed she was losing everything. She was wrong. She wasn't losing her family. She was losing an unhealthy role inside the family. A role built on guilt, dependency, and sacrifice. The family survived. In some ways, it became stronger, because love finally stood on its own, without money, without rescue, without conditions, just love. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. If this story teaches us anything, it is that love without boundaries can slowly become self-betrayal. Sometimes the people we love most do not realize how much we are caring for them until we finally put the burden down. And sometimes the hardest word a mother, grandmother, wife, or sister can say is not goodbye. It is no. Lois did not stop loving her family when she stopped paying their rent. She stopped allowing her love to be used as a financial safety net. That difference matters. Family should never make you feel guilty for needing respect. Your kindness is precious, but it should never become a cage. Your generosity is beautiful, but it should never erase your dignity. And your age does not make you a burden. Your wisdom, your sacrifices, your memories, and your heart still matter deeply. If you have ever been treated like you were only valuable when you were useful, please remember this: you are more than what you provide. You deserve love that does not come with a bill attached. What would you have done in Lois's place? Would you have stopped paying the rent sooner? Or would you have given them another chance? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember their worth.